Okay, welcome. Again, thanks for taking your time out of your day to join us. Today, we're going to be talking about lessons in establishing a test and learn culture. I'm Salim Alkhana. First, we'll talk a little bit about who I am and why I'm talking to you today. Most recently, I've been the Vice President of Product at NBC News, but actually my career has been pretty meandering in product, and I've had a pretty varied set of experiences. I've been in companies with very different cultures, including with respect to experimentation design, from aerospace engineering with the Central Intelligence Agency to product at Amazon, and more recently to kind of media product leadership at AMC Networks and NBC. I've seen a ton of different approaches to product and experimentation, and I've seen the importance of testing and learning in a product strategy. I'm currently most recently at NBC News, where I oversee product design and research for the News Digital team. They're creating world-class set of products for distributing journalism across digital experiences, across web, mobile apps, TV apps, in a variety of content, written, audio, video. It's really exciting. Hundreds of millions of users, hundreds of millions of visits, page views, video engagement. We're really distributing a phenomenal amount of news globally to the world, which has been really exciting. Now, as I kind of reflect upon the different types of product cultures and experimentation cultures, and as I transition out of NBC, I think a lot about company culture and how to develop a culture of testing and learning. So I'm really happy to share some of the lessons that I myself experienced and learned in a very hard way sometimes. And I'm going to share what I've learned and what I've seen around the space from a bunch of other people. And I hope that this is going to be helpful for you. We're going to walk away understanding the importance of a test and learn culture, some of the pitfalls to avoid, and how to take it from there. So great, I'm going to jump in. I think I might be preaching to the choir about the importance of a test and learn culture here. This is the product experimentation virtual forum, but I'll briefly go over this. In a test and learn culture, changes, whether they're product changes, marketing strategy, ad copy, landing pages, etc. These changes are considered hypotheses to be tested. So organization will experiment with a specific hypothesis, observe the results, and then feed the insights from those results into the next cycle of ideation, of decision-making and investment. So in this kind of test and learn culture, that's a culture that values failure. As long as that failure comes with learning. I think failure without learning is called a mistake. Mistakes are generally frowned upon, but I think failure is a great thing because it can tell you the path not to take and potentially the path to take. A test and learn culture lowers the cost of investment because you can take a big grand vision and break it into smaller and smaller chunks and test those individual hypotheses. And that really reduces the risk. And because each of those tests start and end with customer data, you're really the most customer-centric in your decision-making process. This avoids a bunch of other approaches, launch and pray, just kind of launch a feature and see how it goes. Hippo, or making decisions according to the highest paid person's opinion. Or my personal least favorite, competitor-focused development. So just seeing what your competitors do and say, hey, we should do that too. In the best case scenario, you're going to be late to market. In a worst case scenario, your customers will react a lot differently than your competitors' customers. So that doesn't quite work. Okay, so that's a test and learn culture. Let's take a look at how one might experiment and take something large and break it into smaller chunks. We're going to talk a little bit about Airbnb and Airbnb experiences. And Airbnb actually has two sides of their business. I think everyone knows about their lodging business. I'm actually currently in an Airbnb near Acadia National Park in Maine. As James mentioned, I'm traveling right now. If you haven't been to Acadia, I highly recommend it. It's been absolutely beautiful and it's been a real treat. We're road tripping back south now, and so stopped at this Airbnb along the way. And so I felt it would be an apt example. So a little lesser known in Airbnb's business is a newer business line of theirs, which is Experience. They have over 40,000 experiences available in person globally as well as online. And I guess the question is, like, did they launch this in one day with a big kind of demand team to create these 40,000 experiences around the world? Probably not. What they did is they experimented a ton and they started in incremental steps. So let's think about how they could have experimented and figured out customer interest in something like experiences. Before building any sort of experience-specific payment flow, content management, and the UX that they've built here, they could have gauged interest with a painted door test. So saying, as you're booking lodging, saying, hey, you booked a trip in Acadia. Are you interested in any experiences in person while you're there, hiking or paddleboarding or kayaking, which was actually quite fun. Actually, I did it yesterday. They could have iteratively approached these different experience types with different settings and budgets and other things, as you see here, the badging across the UX. They could have started with 1 or 2 geographies, so you're not recruiting experiences and managing experiences around the globe. I know for a fact, for example, Airbnb started their experimentation in San Francisco and Paris. And now, after a few years of this kind of constant iteration, it's actually become a really innovative space where you have things for individuals as well as groups. You have team building events for companies. You have obviously a bunch of family friendly and individual solo traveler stuff. And so all via this culture of experimentation, they've built a ton. So how might one actually think about the cycles of experimentation? We're going to look at Optimizely's 5 stages to the experimental framework, talk about that kind of 5 stages of experiment design. The first one is really determining what's important. It says determine conversion to improve. What's important to us? What are we trying to make better? The second is to hypothesize some change. Hey, we're going to make X change. We think it's going to result in Y. The third is to think about the input and output variables, to identify these variables and create variations. So what sort of audiences or filter of my customers are coming into this experiment? And what is the control and the different variations that they're going to get? Fourth, you run the experiment. That's an important part of experimentation. And then fifth, you measure results. So let's see what data comes in, judge whether it's significant, use that positive or negative result to drive decision making, and decision making on this decision and ideation for our next step. I think this can be simplified a little bit for our example here today into kind of 3 parts of this cycle. In the first, you're really designing the experiment and the hypothesis. In the second, you're running a disciplined experiment. And in the third part of the cycle, you're learning about the results of that experiment, what insights you're gathering from it, and decision making for the next part of the cycle. So you might say, hey, Salim, why are we having this talk? I understand whether it's a 3-part cycle or a 5-part cycle. I'm going to build an experimentation stack, figure out the process, and get people rolling. Well, I think what's actually a quote that comes to mind from David Vismans, who's a chief product officer of Booking.com. He says, large-scale testing is not a technical thing. It's a cultural thing that you need to fully embrace. There's also another quote that comes to mind that I picked up on a podcast recently, which is, culture is not a set of beliefs, it's a set of actions. So if we think that a test and learn culture is important, experimentation is important, it's a cultural thing, not a technical thing, and it's an actions, culture stems from its actions, then I really want to look at the actions that are good and the actions that are bad. So that's why the talk is talking about common pitfalls when establishing a test and learn culture. We're going to look at each part of this simplified cycle: design, run, and learn. And we're going to talk about a couple failures and failures that can happen in each part of this cycle, and how to identify it and how to solve it. So let's start with talking about a couple failures to design. The first one is experimentation as a last thought. So here, experimentation thinking is not incorporated into the full product development lifecycle. You're testing the full features, you're thinking about it as you're QAing and launching and saying, oh, actually, we're going to launch this. How should we test it? How do we think that this is going to be successful? And so what you're seeing here is there's no hypothesis. You're drafting experiment review as you prep for launch, and you're not sure what success would look like or what acceptable guardrail or negative outcomes would look like. So if you have one metric go up and another metric go down a little bit, is that a good thing, or is that acceptable, or is that actually a bad thing? That's definitely something you want to decide before launching the experiment and not try to do this post hoc. So the pain points here is that this kind of uninformed testing doesn't compound. You run a test, you launch a feature, it might tell you what's going right. It might actually be ambiguous or wrong, but it's not really compounding because you haven't broken this large feature down into smaller chunks, into smaller hypotheses, and tested as you go to figure out what is validated by customer data. How do I continue building from here? How do I iterate my product strategy and my product roadmap? And because of this uninformed testing that's kind of all over the place, or not really integrated into the product development lifecycle, the testing velocity is poor and often scattershot. So how do we improve this? You can start with, you really need to start with experimentation goals and design. That is part of your product ideation and discovery process, to say once you're going through discovery and you're figuring out what the thing that you want to build is, how am I breaking that down? How would I experiment? What are my steps along the way? And the second part of that, as I said, is breaking that grand vision into testable hypotheses. A second pitfall is trying to run before you can walk. So how do we identify this? We might see someone trying to aim to solve all of business problems. So like you might take a really important company number like revenue and look to optimize that. Or for me, in my subscription history, subscription kind of product history, you could say, hey, I'm running an experiment and I really want to optimize for 12-month retention. Well, great. I'm going to run an experiment and then I'm going to sit pretty for 12 months and wait for this experiment to run. It can't be like that. You need to be able to test, learn, and iterate. And also, that can be really difficult, trying to tie your experiment on day one with retention on day 365. So trying to do all these complex experiments and run before you can walk leads to these false starts and delays where we think we're about to launch something, but actually we can't start, or high risk complex implementations that are fragile and that won't treat you well. So how do we improve here? You really need to start simple. You can establish proxy metrics. So in the subscription example I gave, if I'm changing something in the user experience today, I can see what that means about the user's session engagement. I can see if users come back within 7 days or if they renew in the next billing cycle. And that that makes a much shorter life cycle of your experiment. So you're not waiting a very long time for a very complex metric. You're looking for these proxies that are upstream that are going to inform your business and making sure that you're going in the right direction. I've linked here a great paper by Babajan and their team. That's great. They have a product. They have an experiment maturity framework where they have it. Normally it's crawl, walk, run. They have a 4-part framework: crawl, walk, run, fly. So if you make it to the fly part of the experimentation framework, they're golden. And of course, I'll distribute this presentation so you can have this link and others within it. Another pitfall in experimentation design is really using experimentation as conflict resolution. So I've heard this, maybe you have as well, in a conference room, and you're pitching an idea or someone's pitching an idea, it's not going too well, and you said, okay, we'll just test it. We'll just try it out. So it seems harmless, right? Oh, well, we have an idea, let's test it. Let's just see what happens. There's a couple of pain points that happen here. First of all, validated by when there's not a substantial hypothesis. This is kind of a spaghetti on the wall approach where this is not a one-time kind of behavior. So like if this happens again and again, this can create a really painful backlog of experimentation where your product team feels really weighed down by the different types of experiments and the different things that we're trying to all just kind of throw it against the wall and see what sticks. This scattershot approach, again, doesn't really provide iterative learnings that can stack together. So how can we improve here? We really need to be thoughtful in experiment design. Ask yourself, what's the real hypothesis we're testing? What do we do next if this experiment succeeds? If you have ideas there, then you can tell this is in line with your strategy. And it's not just like, we can't decide whether A or B, so let's just try to appease everyone and do 10 different things. Next in the cycle, we're gonna talk about how failures in the actual running of the experiment can lead to some pitfalls. So we'll look at one here where the pitfall is when you can't trust the data. So how to identify this? If you're running an experiment and someone says, hey, the dashboard says the numbers went up, but we're not really sure, or people think they don't need to test it because it's not going to actually give them reliable data anyway. This is really painful because you're wasting cycles from your product engineering and other teams and time cycles of running the experiments that don't actually lead to meaningful, credible results and don't stack with learnings. And then this haphazard instrumentation really erodes trust across your organization, increases the number of false starts, and really kind of really isn't a great place to be. So how do we improve here? We really need to invest in data taxonomy early on across your CDP and experimentation stack. Improve that experimentation implementation, even if you're keeping it really simple to start with. Then I wrote here COE, or a center of excellence, really starting with, and this is an idea that you'll see a couple times in this talk, where you're really establishing one center of excellence in the organization for experimentation. This cannot be a thing that starts diffusely across the entire organization to start with. So creating a center of excellence that really fleshes this out fully and gets the ball rolling on healthy experimentation in your organization is a really way to validate the data, run some fun AA tests and simple AB tests to make sure that things are working. That way you can get the ball rolling for the rest of the organization. Lastly, we're going to look at that third part of the cycle, failure to learn from insights. So here's a cartoon that I found pretty salient to our example. How many of you have been in this experience where you walk in, you have an idea, and on the wall is the stuffed heads of everyone who has had a failed idea in the past? What does this look like? What is this company really afraid of? This is a company that can't accept failure. So how do you identify this? These are companies that are averse to taking risk, even in experiments, or expecting every experiment to succeed. I have 2 links at the bottom of this one. One from Microsoft Research, where they found only about 1/3 of the experiments they ran improved the metric that they were aiming to improve. And the second is from the director of product at Slack, who wrote that only 30% of their monetization experiments actually showed positive results. So what I mean here is you got to get used to failure, because if you're going to experiment right now, if you're not experimenting, maybe 2/3 of the stuff you're doing are not working. You just don't know which 2/3 it is. So to improve here, you need to, in my experience and in talking with peers in the industry, you really need to get an executive champion for experimentation and show them the value of this. So by cultivating curiosity with an executive champion, especially in product or marketing, you're able to get some buy-in to say, hey, this is something that is important. We're going to understand the benefits of what we're doing. And if we're failing, we're going to understand what's actually driving that failure, because the experiment will actually tell us where in the chain we're failing. Another a pitfall is hearing we're too busy to test. This is pretty easy to identify because you'll hear someone say, hey, we're too busy to test. Like, that's great, but we can't do it. This has similar pain points as not accepting experimentation. You can't measure the impact of your changes. You miss out on learnings, which can compound, and you'll never get anywhere if you don't actually start with experimentation. So to improve here across the organization, you really need to cultivate curiosity, illustrate that the improvements that your team are making, whether product engineering, marketing, or other, those improvements can be measured, and then touted across the organization as you kind of create that flywheel of improvements that are reaching customers. And then the last pitfall we'll look at is really being stuck in trivial testing. So here, it might be that you're one team fighting the good fight. Other teams can't or won't measure business outcomes as your team does. So it's another symptom of experimentation, thinking not being incorporating and infused across the product lifecycle. And the pain here is that, testing the same ad copy, landing page copy, and button colors has really bad diminishing returns. There's only so much you can really change there to improve the experience. And you're not making movement on larger opportunities that, again, you could break into smaller tests and start to figure out what your hypotheses are and how to get started there. So to improve, again, this is my kind of set of guidance on these last three things: experimentation, executive champion, creating that initial learning group or center of excellence. This is really validated in that Fabajan paper around experimental system maturity from the crawl, walk, run, fly phases. Okay, so we've looked at a bunch of pitfalls here. Let's kind of take a step back and reflect on establishing a test and learn culture. I'll also say, again, this is not exhaustive. There are 7-day workshops given on this topic. There are year-long certificates given on experimentation, and even deeper degrees on experimentation. So this is a crash course in a couple different pitfalls that I've seen, read, and talked with peers in the industry about, and I wanted to share how we could help alleviate some of these pains. So let's kind of reflect on some of these items here. Some of the things we went through are cultivating a sense of curiosity and understanding of the work we're doing and tying that to actually outcomes that we're seeing in the market and from our product. Securing an executive champion to help get some momentum in the organization. This can definitely be done via a groundswell. That, like, the product team is often a place where this starts, because we're making product and engineering development changes that we want to see if we're actually changing outcomes in the market. Start small and focus with one team, one center of excellence to really validate out the basic experimentation stack and start building from there. Be early and rigorous in your hypothesis testing, not trying to just figure this out as you launch. Fifth, break grand challenges into smaller testable hypotheses. Don't try to just ship an entire product and see how it does. And last, building a high trust experimentation system, even if only measuring really simple metrics. I'll include here some extra reading if you want to deep dive on the topic. I found some of these articles and papers really helpful. And then I'll leave you with a final thought. Don't forget your users. I love experimentation. I think we all love experimentation. We are at an experimentation conference. But I will say, experimentation will tell you what, but not why. User research and talking to your users is critically important to understanding their needs and wants. And that's really important to product ideation, to building products that really resonate with users. So thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you spending your day with us today. I've included my contact information here, LinkedIn, as well as email. Please do reach out with any questions or anything I can help you with. And then also, as James mentioned, I would be very grateful if you could please take out your phone, open the camera app, scan that QR code. It is a 1-minute survey on SurveyMonkey. I'd love to hear how you found this talk and how I can improve. Thank you again.
Amazing. Thank you, Salim. Yeah, just leave that up. I'm sure people will get to that. In the meantime, we've got plenty of questions to cover. So firstly, Jim asks, how do you organize tests when you operate in multiple territories?
Yeah, I think subdividing tests it can be done a couple different ways for whether you're running different businesses. For example, I've been in industries where it's been either different plan types for subscription, monthly or annual. I think that there's definitely validity to subdividing and creating an input variable, as we said, around tests. So when you're creating your experiment design, it's equally as much about the input variables as the output. So the output's like, hey, what are we testing? What do we want to go up and to the right? The input's super important as well here, right? Because like, who's the audience that's going into it? And I think that there's a lot of validity to actually subdividing traffic or customers, either depending on your industry and your business, whether it's a canonical thing about what territory they're from and where they subscribed or are paying you from, versus as a visitor where they are today. I think there's a ton of validity to creating an input variable and starting experiments in single countries, using that and then validating that across multiple countries in the future.
Brilliant. And when or how do you know the experiment results are reliable? So instead of just seeing kind of what you want to see.
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of good papers and articles on this. I didn't dive into this because I didn't want this to be kind of too statistical and potentially also out of my range here. But what I've read on this and what I've seen myself is, it's definitely not advised to wait for it to hit that 95% statistical significance and then say, hey, great, we did great. Everyone, we're about to crack some beers. We're done here. I think, and what I've seen in my experience is that you need to really understand what your goals are before you launch the experiment. This is another example of really knowing before you launch how much traffic, how many days kind of define how much traffic, how much visibility this experiment is going to get before you end it. And I think that'll help you get to a pretty statistically significant size so that you're conclusively above your significance threshold. You should not say, hey, when it first hits significance, we're going to end it.
Okay, cool. And quite a particular question here. Do you have any best practices for testing prototypes?
I have really tested prototypes, and my teams have really tested prototypes with user testing and with users in person. So this might be a little different than putting that out in front, in kind of side by side with your product in real time.
And next, Sam asks, do you have any tips on approaching internal funding for experimentation processes when the first few projects didn't yield the results stockholders valued? Obviously, they can get impatient. So any advice on that?
Yeah, that's definitely a good question. What me and my teams have done in the past when we couldn't actually get funding for more complex and robust experimentation systems, we've used simpler, free or close to free services on the internet. Actually, this is not quite free, but it was kind of included in our Google subscription to be able to start basic experimentation with Google 360, and that was a great not even first set of steps in our experimentation system. It actually can do some quite robust experimentation. And so that was a great way to start for our team. And then we ultimately moved to Optimizely, which also is a phenomenal system. I'll add one sentence, which is there are a few open source robust experimentation systems that can help you get started that don't have the high ticket price of some enterprise SaaS products.
Sure. And yeah, we've got one question here. Last question. How did you find collecting the data? Our lack of usable data meant that some stakeholders weren't necessarily brought into the results and ended up going with gut feeling predictions instead. Did you come across a similar scenario? And do you have any tips on how to handle a scenario like this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think this goes back to the crawl, walk, run point. I definitely have seen this in kind of a subscription lifecycle business where we're saying, hey, we actually want to tie in that 3-month or 12-month billing retention to the experiment today. And that was actually something that we couldn't do at the time. And we were trying, and it actually was a pitfall that I myself fell into. It was like, okay, I really would love to tie our experiments to our subscription. We couldn't do it at the time. So what we did is we stayed super simple with in-session and like in that session metrics. So understanding session engagement, much more basic data. So I think that's things that similar to what Google Analytics or similar collect. So in the same session, starting on web, not doing experimentation, although we had loved to at the time, into our iOS or Android products or even our OTT products. Ultimately, it was a lot simpler to start in our web app only, in using data that is collected by a simple analytic system.
Amazing. I think there might have been one more question popped up. Right, it's quite long, but given the limited engineering resources and time, how do you find the optimum balance between time spent on new feature development versus testing some of these features? For example, let's say you can build 10 new features while testing none. Instead, you could test 1, build 8, test 2, build 6, etc. How do you determine the optimum allocation of time and resources? I know it's quite long-winded, but
yeah, no, it's a good question. I think it depends on how you subdivide who's entering the test and understanding the what it's running to. So if the tests are for different parts of your user experience, and the kind of their measurements are able to be kind of controlled separate, then you might be able to run some of these in parallel. But ultimately, I think that what should be done here is you be breaking this into either more easily validated things, or like, if you're trying to build 10 kind of competing features in the same realm, they're all stepping on each other's toes. I think it's probably better to streamline and start with some of your more highest conviction features, and really roll those out and test those to get a kind of quick validation from users that you're on the right path. So I vote, more for testing and being selective about what are your inputs into who you're testing and who's seeing that. That's my current take on it.
Okay, brilliant. And yeah, well, it sounds like we'd have plenty of people who'd like to pick your brain. So yeah, definitely take note of the contact details you have on the screen, as well as the feedback form as well. So I know Salim, like all our speakers, puts a lot of love and effort into these presentations. So I'm sure he'd really appreciate if you gave him some feedback. Likewise, as I said, we'll be putting out our own questionnaire, our own survey. So please let us know what you thought of the day, any improvements that you think could be made. We're always open to suggestions. But that brings a close to our event. That was a great way to end it, Salim. Thank you so much for joining us. Lastly, just head to the Optimize the Exhibitors tab. Still a chance to enter the competition there. And you can also chat to the guys there about experimentation, progressive delivery, and anything else. And yeah, we'll hope to see you again next time. Look out for an email from me with links to the session recordings and the survey, and look out for an email from Optimize with the competition results. But yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Look after yourselves, and keep an eye out for future events.
Thank you.
Cheers, Lee. Bye.